Well, hi everybody, welcome to Stratosphere Lounge. I'm your host, Bill Whittle, for episode number 157 of this remarkable piece of internet flotsam. Also jetsam. In fact, preferably jetsam. How's everybody doing out there? I am your extremely tired host who has really hates to cancel shows and got an awful lot of work to do tonight, so I am going to do I'm going to try to do a quick version of the show, which usually means I keep it under 2 hours. So hopefully I'll keep it under an hour this time. Better that than nothing, I hope. And I think at this point I'm going to just dive right in, other than to say, a week of the hot mic under our belt. That seems to be going well. And let's see what else. The helmet is too small. I'm going to send it back to the manufacturers, and they're going to put a different liner in there and smaller ear seals and see if that works. And if not, we'll have to get it made bigger. But I'd rather have it a little big than a little small. And I know there's a lot of you out there who have written about the Star Citizen thing. I have not contacted anybody yet. I'm still trying to get all my ducks in a line on that one. But they're in a line pretty nearly now, and I'll be getting back to all of you then. So awful sorry about that. Also heard great things about the meetup in Dallas or Fort Worth it was, and how kind everybody was to Scott, and how kind they were to Carla, and taking everybody out. And so thank you very much for that. Also heard I don't want to hear too much about Star Citizen anymore, which suits me. Actually, I was and remain completely fascinated by this, but we have a bunch of other work to get out also. So hopefully tomorrow, or certainly Friday, I'll write a new firewall on The World Gone Insane, and just basically the inversion of reality. I'm going to use the story of this. There's a couple of them now, and there's going to be more of them, but there's a picture of a guy who was, it was a track meet, and the boy-girl in the lead picture didn't look like a girl at all. And basically that story was that this guy was about a second behind the best time for the men, but he was about a second ahead of the best time for the women. And so he decided he wanted to compete in the women's division. And he didn't seem to be particularly committed to this. He just sounded to me like he wanted to compete in where he could win. And his parents were like, well, the most important thing really is that my son is happy. Or my daughter, whatever they said. And my feeling on that is perfectly charming that your son or daughter is happy. I'd love to have them happy. As I said before, it's no skin off of my nose. But what about these other girls who've been robbed here? They've been just robbed, and the girls are not allowed to talk about it. They know they've been robbed, and they know that they're not allowed to talk about it because this is America, and there are things that we just simply don't talk about. And one of them is we don't question the victimhood of people, whatever the motives or the insanity. And basically, I just want to use this as a tee-off to the idea that this kind of thinking is required by progressives, because all of their belief systems are magical thinking like that. If this person says that he is a woman, then she will be allowed to run in the race with other young girls from high school. And if she beats them, she beats them. If the individual beats the girls by 2 or 3 seconds, who are we to say that he can't run in the girls' race because he wants to? And besides, it makes him happy. Who are we to say? I'm going to call it the Republic of Emotion, and that's basically it. You can't have a sane world and have their belief system consistently. In a sane world, you would say, listen, if you do indeed have gender identity issues, it's not a joke, and we know the suicide rate is very high, and I'm certainly not trying to do anything to make your life more uncomfortable. But the world does not always give you what you want, and you're going to have to understand that. Just because you want to run in the girls category, and even if you completely identify as a woman and all the rest of it, biologically, you have muscle and skeletal advantages, and every cell in your body is saying you are biologically male. So by all means, if you want your gender to be whatever you want it to be, I said many times before, it's no skin off of my nose. But now we're talking about the skin off of everybody else's nose. And when you understand this, I couldn't figure out why does this go on? And I realized it's not about transgendered. It's just that's the intro. What it's about is the belief that if I want something enough, I should have it, and if I want something enough and I don't get it, then I'm a victim, and society is obligated to give me what I want, especially and almost really uniquely if I'm a member of a protected group. So this is the belief system, and it has to be that way, because if progressives don't allow biological males to run in the girls' category in high school and whip them all, if they don't allow that, then they're admitting that there are things in the world that are predetermined and you simply cannot change them. And I think I might throw in a picture of a guy who's, 7'2" and a guy who's maybe 4'9", and say the 7'2" guy is not going to be a professional jockey, and the 4'9" guy is not going to be a professional basketball player. They don't have to like it. In fact, most people don't get exactly what they want. But this is a point I keep coming back to again. You don't have any guarantees. This is how secure and how prosperous and how rich and how comfortable our society is, where all of our physical needs have been met. Now all of our emotional needs have to be met too. It's actually a rather good point. And so whatever we feel we should be entitled to, and if we don't get it, then we're victims. And it's some fault in society that the racists and the bigots are preventing me from having my dream come true. Even if your dream conflicts directly with the dreams of the other people. Because while you may have a dream about running with the girls in school because you identify as a woman, that's fine. But there's a lot of biological women out there who want to win races as well. And you're taking away all of their race opportunities to win because of your overwhelming biological advantage. So what about their dreams? What about their hopes? Well, they don't count, you see. They're not as privileged as this particular individual was. So this whole idea extends to their view of economics, right? If we want to believe that we can just print money forever and just keep borrowing it, and the sum gets so big that it doesn't mean anything anymore, then what could go wrong? If we want to believe that you can let a murderer out of prison because he cried at the trial, well, that should be good enough. And if you want to believe that all the things that they believe. So anyway, that's where I'm going with that. I'll try and get that recorded or shot on Friday and get it out next week, because I'm overdue again. So as I said, I'd like to keep this one relatively brief tonight. So we did since I say I'll do a short show, and then I keep getting to questions, and the questions are so interesting, I just keep going on and on and on. But I do have an awful lot to do tonight. We've got a new After Hours coming out with Wayne Allen Root that I'll be editing, and I think I'm doing another interview tomorrow between my morning NRA show, my afternoon NRA show, and then, plus all the members-only content. It's a busy boy here, actually. So I said top 3 questions and by ratings, and it looks like we've got them. I haven't seen them yet. This is becoming a habit, but which is actually probably a good habit. Let me just make sure here. I may have to do 4 questions because number 1 has 8 votes, and then there's a 3-way tie with 6 votes. So I will go quickly, and I'll do the top 4 because I said I'd do the top 3, and I don't see how a 6 gets to beat another 6. So here we go. All right, so the first one's from our friend Merlin Wendelboe, who says that half of the amendments in the Bill of Rights apply specifically to criminals and those suspected of crime. Under what justification, therefore, can the Second Amendment be suspended for ex-cons, and by the same justification cannot be protected against cruel and unusual punishment be suspended? How about the Fifth Amendment? How about all the others? Thou shalt not be infringed means at all. That's an interesting question. I'm not entirely sure I understand it, but I'll take a shot at it, Merlin. If I understand you correctly, you're using the example of Second Amendment being suspended for ex-cons, for felons cannot own firearms, is my understanding. And I think if you're making the point, I think you're saying, okay, well, if you're a felon and you've served your time and been released, I don't want to call it an honorable discharge, but you didn't escape from prison, let's put it that way. if that's the case, then why? And you're not deprived of your First Amendment rights, Fifth Amendment rights, and so on. Why would you be deprived of your Second? And that is an excellent argument. It is an excellent argument. And what makes this argument particularly good is it runs at the intersection between theory and practice. I think that's the thing I like most about it. This is the kind of thing that sits to me right in the twilight zone between theory and practice. So what I mean by that is, in theory, in terms of the philosophy, if a person has served their time, they have basically paid their debt to society, and there's no reason why they should not be allowed to have firearms, since none of their other rights are abridged or infringed upon. That's the theory, and that's the way I'd like to keep things. That's the way I think things should be. But sometimes we have to make, as I said just a moment ago before I even read this question, sometimes you have to understand that you live in the real world. And so the question then becomes, somebody who's committed a felony has, let's just leave the exceptions out, okay? People who maybe do something they're unaware of. Let's just leave that out. Let's talk about criminals. We know what a criminal is, and we know what a dead horse is, so gentlemen, pray let us cease flogging the latter. So a criminal commits some kind of violent crime, and he's convicted of a felony. He serves his time. He gets out. All of his other rights are restored. Why not his Second Amendment rights? In theory, they should come back. In practice, there are some serious questions about this. This is where you have to almost do a little bit of horse trading. And this is where your theory has to confront the real world. And on balance, me personally, I think it's probably appropriate that they're banned from owning firearms. And I would restrict that to people who had committed some kind of an assault or had a weapon on them. In other words, if they had hurt somebody with or without a weapon, or if they'd committed a crime with a weapon and bandied it about, then either one of those two cases tell me that this person is probably not somebody we can risk trusting. Because this is where the philosophical argument gets really interesting, because, again, I hadn't read the question in advance. And so on what grounds are we denying them their Second Amendment right? Well, we'd be denying it on the same grounds that we denied them their freedom when they were put in jail in the first place, right? They violated a criminal code, and we have the freedom to move around, and we have all these other freedoms, but when you are in prison, those freedoms are taken away from you. You don't have the freedom of movement anymore, and so on. And so, in a way, it seems to me, I don't think necessarily for every felon, but as I said, if I was writing the law, where I'm going now with it is that if the felony was either violence towards another person or a gun was used in the felony, or both, certainly both, then in those cases you wouldn't regain your right for a firearm. Or perhaps you wouldn't for 10 years or whatever. I would just consider it to be a probationary period. Maybe that's the answer. Maybe you just have to do an ongoing probation as far as firearms are concerned, and as long as you don't get yourself into any kind of trouble at all after that, then maybe you'd release it. Now, look, the thing that I spend a lot of time thinking about, one of the things I want to work into this firewall I just told you about, is this idea of theory. And how the Bolsheviks were all theorists, and you were a Leninist, or you're a Trotskyist, or you were a Bukharinite, or you were a right Trotskyist, or you were a net man, and everything was theory. And this revolution was brought about by intellectuals who did nothing but talk about things and talk about theories. And Marxism, all of Marxism is this theory that just doesn't work. And so while it's nice to have this theory, there comes a point when you have to realize that there are some people that just are not going to play by the rules. And since they're not willing to play by the rules, they're not entitled to be protected by the rules. I think that's probably where I would go with that. I think I would probably say the rights that you talk about are rights guaranteed to American citizens, and we're not taking away your American citizenship. But you have basically violated the social compact, right, by committing a crime. We didn't just randomly say no guns for you. And that's kind of where you'd be in terms of comfort level. But the reality of the situation, of course, is that law-abiding people don't break the law by definition, but in terms of what that means in reality is the vast number, and I mean the huge number, of people who have legally bought firearms never use them in crimes. Because if you legally buy a firearm and go to the trouble to do that, you strike me as a person who's understood that crime is for losers, and that and it's not like a slogan, crime is for losers. A crime is for people who are either so ignorant or so broken on some level, emotionally, whatever. And this could be a result of their environment. I'm happy to admit that. But the point is, if you become a criminal, you've done so because for whatever reason, you understand that playing by the rules is not going to get you where you want to be. That's your belief. It's not true, but that's your belief. And so you think that the reward justifies the risk. Interesting spin-off of this is the idea that in inner cities today, that the drug dealers are in fact the most motivated and the most intelligent people in the community, because since there is no economy in so many of these areas, they are the ones who are out there doing the entrepreneurialism. But anyway, I think that's basically it. If I had to, decide, Merlin, and then I could, of course, just go right down the other way and say, hey, what about your other rights? Your other rights are not restricted. That's a great argument. I know that when I come to a conflict between theory and practice, my head goes to theory and my heart goes to practice. My head tells me that those Second Amendment rights should be restored, and then my heart tells me that if I do that, that's going to be a problem. And there is a justification for it. It's not like, as I said, it's not random. It's based on the decision of the person that committed the felony. That's a very good question, and the kind of thing that sparks a lot of thinking from people smarter than me. All right, so number one of the three-way tie for number 6 is from Steve Darrow, our friend Steve Darrow, who says, I tried to word this question differently in an earlier Stratosphere Lounge, but I got too wordy and you addressed another part of my question instead of the part I intended. So let me try again. Progressives take the fundamental need for proper regulation, building codes. Oh yes, this goes to the vapor boundary thing. I remember Steve now. Okay. Progressives take the fundamental need for proper regulation, building codes, environment, banks, and airlines, to name a few, and use that need as a means to further advance their agenda of creating an ever larger government. You've talked about asymptomatic actions and your idea of increasing awesomeness, but I am looking for the principle of when government involvement is justified and how to determine when it has gone too far. You and Merlin have been hanging out drinking some coffee, I guess. Let me see if I get this correctly. When I say increasing awesomeness, it's a reference to an analogy I've used before that I call King of the Hill. And basically it's like this. If you have a graph where the vertical line is human awesomeness, and the doing this backwards because I have to mirror it. Yes. Okay, so here's human awesomeness, and here is increasing activism, right? More and more social activism. And the way it looks to me is it's a bell curve. So here we've got misery, and then as we increase our activism, we get more and more and more awesomeness, which means happiness, freedom, and all the rest of it. But there comes a point when as we continue to increase our activism, we actually get less and less and less freedom. And that's when you are over the hill, literally over the hill. And that's when you have to go backwards. You have to conserve the top position. So my argument is that all freedom-loving people are liberals while people are being oppressed. But once people have stopped being oppressed, and now it becomes things like racial quotas and things like, hate speech and protected speech and all the rest. Now you've gone too far. You have to get back up to the top of the hill, because more activism is actually reducing human freedom and happiness and awesomeness. So what's the principle? Well, I haven't read these before. I know I keep saying that because I have to think on my feet here, but I would say, just chewing on it a bit, Steve, I'd go to the fundamental principle of what I believe in, which is everybody should be left alone unless they infringe upon another person. And the definition of infringing is those 3 laws, or 2, depending on how you want to do it. I like to say it's 3 things. You can do whatever you damn well want to, so long as you don't hurt anybody, you don't take their stuff, and you do what you promise you're going to do. So any form of burglary is taking their stuff, any kind of an assault is hurting somebody, and any kind of contract violation is not doing what you promised to do. So then the question becomes, if we use that as a guideline, how much government do we get, and how much do we need? And I think you'd be quite shocked to realize how little government we would need in a case like that. So let's take a couple of examples. Just one of the ones you included, and one. There goes Superstar Carla. We'll see you tomorrow. Let's take airline regulations. Many people say that if you didn't have laws, if you didn't have regulations about airline maintenance, then the market would determine that the companies that cheat on maintenance go out of business. Probably true, but unfortunately, they would lose their reputation because, a number of people died. I've been pretty close to, I studied quite somewhat in depth the Alaska Airlines accident that happened out here in the 90s. It was just off the point where I go flying all the time. And that accident interests me primarily as a pilot because it was a long process. It was, from the time they took off from Mexico, they were headed, I think, for San Francisco or Seattle, one of those places. And they found out the plane was getting harder to trim, and the more they tried to change the trim on the horizontal stabilizer, the worse the problem got. And then they stopped messing around with it. Then they, Anyway, the point is they had a problem, and the more they tried to fix the problem, the worse the problem became. And the problem was that just a jack screw that adjusts the trim on the horizontal stabilizer had been inadequately maintained and was not lubricated well enough, and it basically froze up. And when it got to the point where it froze up enough, I think the whole thing just detached and just came loose, or it trimmed the airplane into an unflyable position. And in any event, they started out at something like 28,000 feet, somewhere in there, 30,000 feet, and had a problem, descended, and then the plane just was holding on for a while, and then they just lost it and rolled inverted and went into the water from a fairly decent altitude, and it was witnessed by a bunch of other pilots as well. And the air traffic control recordings of that are pretty terrible, and pilots doing everything he can, so is the co-pilot as usual, fighting it all the way down. Now, that was a violation of federal regulations regarding maintenance procedures, and it was an intentional violation designed to save money and cut corners. I know this is strong language, but this is what I believe in. It was in 2000. Thank you, T-Dog. You could make a fairly compelling case that that Alaska Airlines murdered those people. There was a case being made. God, who was it? It might have been. What's her name? It might have been Commodore Vanderbilt, or maybe it was Mark Twain. Somebody was basically saying that if a ship sails, they were making this argument back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, maybe a little earlier, and basically this person said, look, if I have a shipping company and I know the ship is a fire trap, and I know it's leaky, and I know the rigging isn't good, and I know all of these things about it, and I know the captain's a drunkard and all the rest, and I put people on that ship knowing these things, and then something happens, I'm responsible. I've committed some kind of murder there because I knew better and I allowed it to go on anyway. And what that Alaska Airlines incident tells me is certainly somebody knew better. Somebody said, no, we're not going to do that. There's a book on procedures on how they're supposed to go. And somebody said on the shop floor, somebody said, no, we're not going to do that. We don't have time. Now that is not a decision made by a mechanic or a top-level A&P. That's a decision put on the guy in charge of the repair facility by management upstairs who are saying we're bleeding money, and if you want to keep your job, we're going to have to find a way to cut corners and so on and so forth. However, this is a perfect example to me of a regulation that needs to be there. And the argument that, well, now that we knew that Alaska cheats on their maintenance, the market's going to basically put them out of business, small consolation to the people on board that aircraft. And the people boarded that aircraft with, I think, a reasonable supposition of safety. I think that's a pretty good expression. I had a pilot tell me once there are two different kinds of aviation accidents, and it basically works like this. Pilot gets killed and goes to stand in front of St. Peter. And the two different kind of accidents are when St. Peter says, "Hey, tough break, kid." And the other one is where St. Peter says, "What the hell were you thinking?" Tough break, kid is something that it's out of your control. Something happens and nothing you can do about it. What were you think is when you flying drunk, or you fly into weather that you know is bad, or you're trying to run under clouds, that kind of thing. Passengers are, you can't expect to be protected from tough break kid accidents, and that's why it's defined as an act of God kind of thing. But you do have, I think, a right to be, if we don't trust people enough to provide what I would call ambient level of safety, then that person is their fist is hitting my nose, right? In other words, an ambient level of safety is kind of like what we talked about a couple episodes with the ambient level of risk. Somebody mentioned in the comments section, should the fact that you can own firearms mean that you could own a tank? Probably. Does it mean you could own a nuclear weapon? And the answer, I think, is no, because the ambient risk is so high, and furthermore, it's hard for me to imagine defending yourself with a nuclear weapon. I mean, that would be a fairly dramatic statement of individual crankiness. So there's also, I think, an ambient level of trust that a society needs in order for it to work, and we have to have a fundamental level of trust. Now, when you have this level of trust, then you start getting into all of the lawsuits. Was this trust violated? Was it an accident? Did they know? The lawsuits are awarded, and then the insurance companies pay out, and so then the companies decide it's easier to settle. The insurance premiums go up, the amount of lawsuits goes up, and you're stuck with this mess that we have now. So the question is, nobody disagrees about the airline maintenance regulations. The question is, what do we do about all the other ones? And my answer is, we repeal them all. We certainly repeal any regulation that does not involve physical harm to somebody else. So if you are putting chemicals into the river, I'm sorry, it may be your factory, but it's not your river. And the people downstream from you have not agreed to this activity. But when you get into the kind of silly let me take an absolutely really ridiculous example, which is apparently true. Up in, it's either Oregon or Washington State, I think it was Washington. Somebody was telling me now that the state is actually flying drones over people's property, and what they're doing is they're comparing photographs, before and after photographs, to make sure that nobody cuts down any trees on their property, because if you cut down a tree on your own property, you cut down a tree on, you own 100 acres and there's a tree right in the middle of it. In Washington, if you cut that tree down without a permit, you are subject to a substantial fine. And one of the cases that got a lot of attention was that a guy deep on his own property, owned a lot of property, decided to put in a pond, dug out this big hole, lined it with plastic, put water in there, reeds, became a wildlife sanctuary, ducks were there, all of this stuff. Everything was working great. It was beautiful. It was nice. Nobody complaining. He's not putting mercury in there. He's just putting water in there. And he provided this incredible habitat because he liked the look of it. And it's his property and his money. Well, they found out that he did it. And the state made him fill it in, fined him, and then told him if he wanted a pond, he had to apply for the license, which was hundreds or thousands of dollars, in which case he could then do exactly what he had just done on his own property using his own money. And the people that wrote those laws need to be burned at the stake. And so do the people that enforce those laws. Those people need to be burned at the stake publicly during prime time, although prime time, kids, is a time that meant that everybody was watching TV at the same time. It's getting a little old. Because that's a perfect example of the kind of thing that is not in the public interest, in fact, is a gross violation of that person's freedom. And furthermore, one of the things that you understand, and Natasha's helped me understand this quite a lot too, and that is this. so many of these regulations are not designed in the public interest. Many of these regulations, when you get right down to it, are revenue streams for the state or the federal government. If these swine can make it so that every single person in America is violating some law or another, some regulation rather, not a criminal law. If it turns out that that's the case, then just think of all the money that the government can make from fining people. And I think all of this kudzu needs to be cleared out. In order to have that regulation put in place, you would have to make a pretty clear, compelling argument, same kind of argument with any other crime. You'd have to make the argument that this company is risking or harming people beyond a reasonable doubt. And if you can't prove that harm, and the burden would be on the state in this case, then the regulation goes away. So if a guy's putting a tree in his backyard or cutting a down tree, it's his own damn business. It's his own yard. It's his own tree. And same thing if he wants to put in a pond. If he wants to put in a pond, rock on. If he puts mercury in there and it contaminates the water table, then that's a different story, right? Pretty simple, really. The whole situation is really just out of control, and the boundary line gets dimmer and dimmer. But every time I have a question I don't know how to answer, I go back to the 3 laws, and it usually sets me straight. So I would say that, yeah, pretty much eliminate all of them theoretically. Eliminate them. You kind of, it's like making a chess move. You keep your finger on the piece. You basically say, as far as we're concerned, they're virtually all going to be eliminated. However, during this process, we're going to see which ones we think are essential and which can be made a case for, airline regulation and maintenance being one of them. And then the rest of it goes away. That'd be nice if that were to happen, I think. Okay, so number 2 out of the 3-way tie is from Cameron C. Smith, who says, Bill, how effective are our guided weapons systems against a modern military with the capability to jam their guidance systems? It seems like it would be worthwhile to keep some old-school naval artillery lying around because those shells cannot be redirected. Any thoughts? Yeah, there are. When the GPS system was first installed and working, there was a lot of talk about whether or not a GPS receiver should be released to the public, and a lot of people in the military thought no, and GPS was put there basically for this purpose, for guiding weapons and so on, and for military operations. And the usefulness of it became apparent long before smartphones showed up. So I remember when GPS first appeared, the state-of-the-art in aircraft navigation was called LORAN, which is it's something you could get a moving map out of LORAN, and it would probably get you somewhere within a mile or two of where you are. It wasn't enough to fly precision approach and so on. And when GPS first came out, they dithered it, I think is the term. And basically what they did was they intentionally degraded the GPS's ability in a civilian unit. Actually, I think the dithering is something that they could turn on, rather. I think that's something they did to the signal. And maybe their own receivers were immune from it. But in any event, they basically, for a number of years, said, okay, you can have a GPS which will put you within a mile of where you want to be, but we're not going to have one that lets you put you within 3 feet, which apparently is the resolution now, or of where you are. And then finally, people just said, look, the benefits just outweigh the risks, and now we have, moving maps, and we have Uber, and we have all the other things, all of which would be impossible without GPS. I know that there has been serious discussions about a fairly sophisticated adversary being able to jam GPS locally, and let's just say in a very small area. Let's say within a region of 2 or 3 miles, and put a tremendous signal up there that scrambles the GPS signal. We have other means of directing weapons that are not dependent on GPS, and if the GPS system were taken out, those wouldn't affect things like our television-guided Maverick missiles or our laser-guided GBUs or all the rest of it. But the reason that we use so many GPS-guided weapons is because it's probably the biggest bargain that we've ever made. And we all remember the first Gulf War and these smart weapons, and these smart bombs were engineered to be smart bombs, and they had infrared guider or guidance or laser guidance. They'd track a laser target designator, or they'd track a TV image or whatever. But it didn't work in all weather conditions. If it was foggy or cloudy, they couldn't get the signal back up to the weapon. And somebody realized, wait a minute, now GPS can get these bombs there. And somebody else said, yeah, but then we have to make all these GPS bombs. And then some third guy who's smarter than the other two says, hold on, we have something like, and somebody's going to give me the number, but I want to say 50,000 surplus iron fall bombs with no guidance whatsoever. Something like some insane number of 250-pound, 500-pound, even 1,000-pound bombs that were manufactured for the Vietnam conflict. They're just iron weapons. Just drop them out of an airplane and hope they hit something. And somebody said, "Now hang on. If we were to make a tiny little unit that just consisted of stabilizing fins and little little ailerons on those fins, and we put the GPS unit in the back of it." For a relatively low cost, we could basically steer an iron bomb right to the target. And that's basically why we have the JDAM. That's the weapon that's been used to convert dumb weapons into smart ones. I hate to bail out of the question like this, Cameron, but I do have a lot of confidence in the fact that you're not the first person to worry about this, and neither am I. I don't know whether the military is able to encrypt that signal. I suspect there is certainly a way to do it. I would be quite shocked if there wasn't. I suspect that if things really got hot, it would be possible to deactivate the GPS system so that only military-type receivers would be able to decode it. Now, that means that you would assume the enemy would also have GPS-guided weapons. If the signal is out there, chances are they could decrypt it, although I have to tell you, with electronic encryption, it's very tough. And so that may mean that their weapons are using your guidance systems to hit your target, but that's not really the problem we're talking about. Problem we're talking about is, can our weapons hit their target? And I think I would be very surprised if it turns out that that is not true. That's that. And by the way, parenthetically, this is why, the Europeans, they're so proud of what they do because it's better than what we do. And the only problem with their systems is that it's 40 years after we do it. We build the 747, the most amazing aircraft ever made, in my opinion, certainly one of them. The fastest, by the way, lots and lots of power. And it's the biggest commercial airplane in the world for 40 years. And finally, they build the A380, which is bigger in some dimensions than the 747 by, 7 feet or something like that. Oh, the A380 is the most... Yeah, okay, so you built a big airplane. Did it... We flew ours in, 1970? And you did yours in 2005 or something like that. And same thing now with their GPS system, which they're calling Magellan. And they're going to put up an entire constellation of satellites. Their justification for this Magellan system is that if the U.S. GPS, I don't know what the accuracy is, somebody's going to tell me, Vipercheck will probably tell me. If the U.S. GPS system is accurate to within 3 feet or whatever, then theirs is accurate to maybe it's 3 meters for the U.S. system and theirs is going to be 1 meter. And it's like, listen, folks, the difference between 3 meters and 1 meter in any kind of a real-world application is just meaningless. So why are they going to all this expense? I thought it was for national prestige, but obviously I think the nations of the European Union would like to have a system that they get to keep the switch on and not be dependent on the United States switching the whole thing off. I'd be surprised if the Russians didn't have a GPS system either up or on their way up for those reasons, So I get the feeling that our friend Vipercheck here could probably tell you more about what we do about GPS jamming of weapons than I could, and I'll bet there's a lot he could talk about that he can't talk about. But I have some confidence that this is not just something as simple as, oh, well, it looks like the enemy's using our GPS system, or, oh, well, the enemy has, jammed the signal. If you can jam the GPS signal, as I said, but you have a secondary backup with laser-guided weapons, and I think cruise missiles are inertial guided with a radar terminal phase, that kind of thing. So anyway, that's about all I can say about that one. And then we are back to Steve Darrow for the three-way tie. If I'd read ahead, I would have just said the three that I said. So anyway, I did agree to do all three with the 6s. So Steve Darrow's back with the third of the three-way tie, and he says, with our newest justice being sworn in recently, please discuss the importance of his originalist philosophy with regard to the Constitution and other laws that have been repeatedly, quote, interpreted, unquote, by the judiciary to mean something that they do not expressly say. Isn't this a blatant violation of the separation of powers? I don't know if it's a blatant separation of the violation of separation of powers. Here's one thing I do know, though, and I've seen this repeatedly, and I think this is one of the most important things I've ever talked about. It's the interpretation of the Constitution that's gotten us into so much trouble. Congress justifies Obamacare by the Commerce Clause. It says the Commerce Clause gives Congress the right to regulate commerce among the people, among the states, rather, and then leaves out the fact that it doesn't say of the people. It allows Congress to regulate commerce between the states, foreign powers, and Indian tribes. And the Constitution repeatedly says there are three entities that we're talking about in this operator's manual. There's the federal government called the United States. There's the states, which are the states, and then there's the people. So if the Commerce Clause were supposed to say what these progressives who use it to justify any government program, if it was going to say what they thought it, or they're selling it as, then it would have said Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce among the people, but it doesn't say that. So why am I bringing this up? Because the Commerce Clause is so obviously, clearly, absolutely not authorizing the kind of abuse that we see. Nevertheless, constitutional scholars and the Supreme Court and everything will go to precedent. Now, precedent is important in legal systems. I understand that, and the power of precedent is okay. But I had a real breakthrough thought, this is probably 4 or 5 years ago, where the Supreme Court had done a couple of interpretations, and the most famous one, I forget the name of it, I think, but basically the Supreme Court ruled that a guy couldn't feed his own corn to his own animals because it did something to the price of corn or something like that, which was being regulated. So the Supreme Court basically ruled that the federal government had the right to individually regulate the commerce of the people. And the Supreme Court ruled it in the 30s when they did all the other damage during the Progressive era, or maybe a little bit earlier. And so, presumably, we're stuck with it. But here's the breakthrough thought. When I say this is an English sentence, it's written in very understandable English, it's consistent with everything else that's written in the Constitution, there's not a shred of doubt about it. Not a shred of doubt about it. And people say, yeah, well, the Supreme Court ruled this. Then my response is, well, then the Supreme Court is wrong. And it's just wrong. How can you say that? Are you a constitutional scholar? No, that's why I can say it. I can say it because it's an English sentence, and I can read English sentences, and I can understand what they mean. And the power that the Supreme Court has is granted to them by this document. And the document says that Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce among the states, foreign powers, and the Indian tribes. I am not a state, I'm not a foreign power, and I'm not an Indian tribe. Congress has no power whatsoever over me or my commerce. And as I said earlier, if they'd wanted it to be that way, they would have said Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce among the people, but it doesn't, so they don't. So when people say, well, the court ruled differently, well, then the court was wrong. The court was wrong. It ruled for a political reason or whatever. This is the point I think really bears mentioning. So many of the things that are up in front of the Supreme Court are just really, shaving a human hair right down the middle, dicing a human hair vertically, 10 different ways in terms of small nuance. And for that, you need great legal minds. And I'm not disparaging that for that application. But when you're dealing with fundamental things like an English sentence that is as clear as day, and by the way, a great deal of effort went into making it as clear as day. Governor Washington and all the not Washington, Governor Warren. I've forgotten. I'll remember. Morris. He was in charge of the Committee on Style, and basically what was happening is in one room, all of the constitutional, the framers are deciding, here's what we're going to do. Yes, we all agree on this. This is going to happen in this order. Yes. Okay, here you go, Committee on Style. Take what we've told you about how the government operates and put it in the simplest possible language. And that takes a great deal of skill. Any idiot can make things complex. It takes a genius to make things simple. And And Gouverneur Morris was a genius. He wrote "We the People of the United States of America" in order to form a more perfect union. Apparently, that came from his pen. So, not only is the sentence clear, but a great deal of effort went into making the sentence crystal clear. Same thing with the Second Amendment. This is another one that gets a lot of bandying back and forth. The bit about a militia, being you think I know it by heart by now, but the whole idea that the Second Amendment says that the reason you can have a weapon is for a militia, therefore individual citizens cannot have weapons, is wrong on 2 points. I made a video called Your Second Amendment. On the first point, it says that while a militia is a nice thing for a government to have, and while a militia is a useful thing for people with guns to do, the right of the citizen to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. There's nothing that disqualifies that cause. It's basically like saying the ability to make an announcement about a birthday party being an important part of life in society. My ability to speak freely shall not be infringed. It doesn't mean I only have to talk about birthday parties. It means that this is one of the nice things that can happen if you have freedom of speech, but it doesn't mean you have freedom of speech specifically just to that example. Same with the Second Amendment. It's nice to have a militia, and militias at the time were very important, and that's why the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And again, the founders were absolutely clear. They were not only not idiots, they were geniuses. If they had wanted the country to follow the rules that the progressives claimed that they wanted, then the Second Amendment would have been very simple. It would have said simply the right of a well-trained militia to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, and that would have been it. And then you would have had a case, the right of a well-trained militia to keep and bear arms. Okay, so that's clear, but that's not what it says, and there's no question about what it said. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the maintenance of a free state. Yeah. So they put it in there because militias, there was no army at the time. There essentially was no standing army. There's a big deal of argument about whether we should have one or not. And so basically they said, look, we need this. Militias are handy and militias are good for the defense. But the first part is Arcturus says, it's a descriptor. It's like I said, it's like, here's something that's nice that comes from the fact that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. It's as clear as it gets. It's as clear as it can be. And so there you go. It's not up for discussion. And furthermore, this is a much better argument. Somebody came up to me after a speaking event and just said this to me in the space of 6-7 seconds, then just smiled and walked away. And I thought, oh, of course. I mean, my God. What is a militia? A militia is a group of people who have their own weapons. That's the difference between a militia and a standing army, right? A standing army is a group of soldiers who report to the base, and they are issued weapons, and they are now part of the United States Army. A militia is a group of citizens who come together under some kind of command structure and who bring their own weapons. And that, to me, when I heard that, I thought, of course, of course. Why are we wasting time with the rest of this? That's all you need to know to shoot this stuff down. That's a definition of a militia, you idiots. So, there you go. Some of this stuff's actually very simple. Some of it's not so simple. Great questions, and I'm going to have to really actually end this thing in less than an hour, which is, I think, probably a record for a Stratosphere Lounge show. I don't think we've ever done one less than an hour. But we did 4 questions instead of 3, and I have to apologize for begging off after such a short time, but I am on an awful lot of work to do, and I'm really quite tired, so there you go. Also, I have a family life now, which is pretty nice. Honey, I'm on my way home. So that's that. Hopefully I expect to be back next week. Again, if you came in late, if you wrote about Star Citizen, I have not emailed anybody back yet about that, and I'm very close to having the point to do that. I have actually hired somebody to see if I can get the assets and do what I want to do technically. So before I start ringing all these bells, I want to know that I can pull off what I think I can pull off, and I need to see some evidence of that, at which point I'm going to go out. But I have been thinking about it almost nonstop. I brought my friend Alfonso Rachel over to this little wonderland here last week and told him about it. He got it immediately. And the reason I brought Zoe in and talked to him about it was because I've seen Zoe as an actor. He's a terrific actor. So I thought the two of us might make an interesting, interesting pair of lead characters. And I got the whole story worked out. I'm not going to talk too much. I'm not going to talk at all about Star Citizen, other than to say, I mean, I'm not going to talk about the details of the game or any of that nonsense. But it's becoming clearer and clearer to me that I think the angle I will take on these stories is that I'm going to play a character who is, getting older and is part of this, Imperial Navy, and he's a fighter pilot, and I get to have that little fantasy of mine. But he's a colonel, and he's getting tired, and he's getting a little old. And Viper Check says he'll help. Don't you worry, Foghorn. You're the first person I'm going to talk to, and I'm going to talk to you first, so you have nothing to worry about there, young man. But basically, a guy who used to have a life, and who was promised all these things, and who basically, I think the thing should start off with these people are coming back from a patrol. This guy's leading a flight of one. He's got some nugget out there, somebody new who's never really, just learning their first combat thing. He brings them in, and then what I wanted to do is I just wanted to have him sitting in the dressing room taking off all this gear, because in the game everybody's wearing these very skin-tight pressure suits, and it's a cool way to go. But everybody's wearing pressure suits all the time, and they're wearing helmets all the time. And I wanted to have him peel all these layers off, and the helmet comes off, and then he's neoprene, and then over that underneath that is a water-cooled vest, and then there's all these armor devices and all the rest of it. And it's just the guy's getting old, and he's getting creaky. He used to be able to get out of his flight suit and out of his gear in 2 minutes. Now it takes him 20 minutes. And I just want to start off with the fact that he's disgruntled. And as I've thought more and more about it, basically, I'm going to be playing John Boyd, because Boyd deserves some credit. I might try to make his actual story someday, but for those of you who don't remember the many discussions we've had about John Boyd was called the Mad Monk, and he was a theorist who was a flight instructor at the U.S. Air Force tactical training grounds in Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. And they called him 42nd Boyd because Boyd had a running bet with anybody that he could start out with that person in quarter mile in trail. And within 40 seconds, he'd have that guy in his sights. He'd reverse the situation. And if he couldn't do it in 40 seconds, he'd give the guy $40 by a mistake dinner. And Boyd never shot down anybody. He was not an ace. Didn't have any kills at all. But Boyd was an honest-to-God genius, an actual breakout Burt Rutan level genius. And he was, a very unhappy guy. And this story element started to come together for me because basically what I'm trying to do in the game, I know I told you I wouldn't talk about it, but I'm going to talk a little bit about it because I think this part is interesting, not so much the mechanics of it. There are all these organizations in the game, and some of them have 12,000 members already, and those numbers are going to get bigger. And I thought, all right, if we're going to recruit people, why would they come here? And that led me to some very, very interesting thoughts, because there are organizations out there already that are like test squadrons, and there are, there's pirate guilds, and there's all these things, all of them. And some of them are very good exploration units and all the rest, and they're recruiting like any other clan in a online game. But I thought about this, and I thought, why would people want to be a part of this, and what would make this different? And then I had what I thought was a rather profound thought. As I said, the organizations in Star Citizen are very, very well thought out. They've got tremendous recruiting videos. There's an exploration. There's a number of exploration things. There's we're going to be mercenaries, and we're going to be doing escort duty, and we're going to be exploration, and we're going to do all these things out there. And they have tens of thousands of members, some of them. But I thought, what makes this unique? And I realized it's unique because I'm trying to make a country. And that's what gave me a real insight into looking at some of the issues I've been talking about for a while. Yeah, I broke the hour mark. I don't care. Thanks, Mr. Pershing. In other words, would you be willing to die for a trade cartel? Would you be willing to die for a mercenary band? Would you be willing to die for any of these things? The movies start off with this guy being a fighter pilot, but the organization he's fighting for against this, kind of lazy reptilian kind of a alien species, lazy in terms of the design. but he's fighting for the UEE, which is the United Earth Empire, and it's led by an imperator. And he is prime citizen, and I would like to start this thing with this guy basically saying, I don't feel like dying for a prime citizen. I'll risk my life for my family and for freedom and all the rest of these things, but I'm not going to do it for an imperator. And so the guy is basically a kind of a breakout tactical wizard, and they've basically put him in the butt end of the universe, way out in the middle of nowhere with this puny little system, a big gas giant, a couple of moons. And then he gets recruits assigned to him, and the recruits, when they realize they've been assigned to him, are so disappointed because they think they're going to be doing basically, basically, sweeping up leaves for fighter pilots kind of thing. They'd rather be out with the fleet and the carriers and all the rest, and instead they're stuck on patrolling this, out of the way outpost with this, aging lunatic. But this is where the opportunity comes in, because I realize that I like to talk about flying, and I think I'm a decent flight instructor. And if I can get this guy to be instructing these young pilots in the game, which will be characters and there will be scripts, and Zoe will play my adjutant. I told him his call sign should be Sledge because he has a band called 20 Pound Sledge and he loved it. And Sledge understands what this guy is. And basically, he starts that first episode by saying, "I know you think you're here in the butt of the world, but you people are about to get the best training in the universe, and you don't even know it yet." And I want to have my character come in and say, "I'm looking." He wouldn't ask this question. I say, "Okay, I see that this guy's got the highest scores in The Sims. You're probably going to be the one who gets killed first, huh?" Because Sims are, you've trained so hard in Sims, and Sims aren't reality. And the reason they're not reality is because on some level psychologically, no matter what the penalty is, in a Sim that if you do something risky and you make a mistake, then you make a mistake. You just go do it again. And if you're very, very good at that in Sims, then chances are you're going to try that out in the real world, and I think that's why you're probably going to be the first one to be killed. And that is really cool, because then it allows me to speak to primarily young men and speak to them in a way that should interest them, because everybody in the game likes flying the spaceships and going pew, 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 pew in space combat. I've seen hours, hundreds, probably 100 hours of gameplay now, and I've never, ever seen 2 aircraft flying in formation. And if I could basically do that so that if I'm having a briefing session, let's say, and I've got a room full of these, young pilots, a whole new, training squadron come in, I would put up a picture. I would put up a picture of Thatch. I've forgotten his first name. I will find out, because it's worthy of me finding out that. I will take this 10 seconds to do that. John S. Thatch. I'd have a picture of him, and this universe in the game is set almost 1,000 years in the future. And I would basically say, this man on the screen is going to keep you alive. Anybody know from the uniform where he's from? And somebody's going to say the Civil War. And it's like, no, it was a little later than the Civil War, because the history is so old. And I'm going to explain the Thatch Weave, because basically what I'm going to say is we are facing people who have better equipment than we do, and many of them are more skilled than we are. So if we go out there and do what we have been doing, we're going to get creamed. We're just going to get killed. And the government doesn't care, because there's more of us where they came from. But we're flying ancient equipment, rust buckets, lead sleds, garbage, and private civilians and armed bands have much better gear than we do, and many of them are more experienced pilots. So we are going to go out there and get killed if we don't understand what this man up here is teaching us. And then I'm going to talk about how he basically gets into the very early days of the Pacific War. Thatch is on a carrier. He realizes he's got Wildcats, which are big barrel-y boats. They're just big, fat, unmaneuverable flying buses. And he's going up against Japanese Zeros, which are incredibly agile. They're incredibly quick. They can climb much faster than the Wildcats. And all of this, and the Zeros are just waxing our guys. They're just splashing them all over the place. And Thatch sat there. My understanding is he might have done it on the wing of a Wildcat after he landed. He had this vision. I know he did it with matchsticks. And basically Thatch said that if we have two guys, and as we're trying to pursue a pilot, normally another Japanese pilot would get behind us. We're target locked on this leader, and we get shot down in flames, never even see the guy. But Thatch basically said if we have two guys that are constantly just doing this weave, if they're doing the weave, then they'll be able to intercept and pull off the wingman of the guy we're trying to shoot down, and then we can get the primary, and then we can go after the secondary. But it would take discipline. And then I'm going to drag in a little bit of Victor Davis Hanson, because I can put this all into one lesson and do it in 2 minutes, because I get to write a script with different characters and people asking questions. And then I'm going to open by saying, okay, so what does this mean? And then I'm going to put two pictures up there. And I'm going to have a picture of a Persian warrior with his incredible gear, and and his sword and his horse, and and his javelins, and all of his art is all engraved, and his swords and his shields got all this. He's this totally equipped warrior. And then on the other side of the split screen, I'm going to have a farmer, basically in a peasant's tunic, with felt boots on, standing behind a plow. And I'm going to say, the guy on the left, the warrior, has trained all his life on weaponry. All his life. That's all he does. And furthermore, he outnumbers the farmer 4-1, 8-1, 10-1. And yet, the farmer kicked his ass for 500 years. Kicked his ass. Why? Because the hoplite, the Greek hoplite, was the first time that they understood that we don't want warriors, we want soldiers. And that prior to the Greek hoplite, a warrior achieved renown in battle, and his brownie points went to his personal courage. So if a warrior would dash across and get into the other line and kill 3 or 4 guys and come back, he's a hero. But the hoplite was just the exact precise opposite of that. The hoplite's duty was to stand there, cover his person on his right with his shield arm, or person on his left, I guess. In any event, hold his shield up high enough, which is a heavy shield, so that the person who's standing next to him is protected by his shield. He's protected by the shield of the guy next to him, and so on. And they formed this kind of impenetrable wall, and it's called a phalanx, and the phalanx was unbeatable. The phalanx of 1,000 Thebans or Spartans or Athenians would take down 40,000, 50,000 of these people who'd practiced warfare all their lives. And that's what happens when you have discipline. Discipline. It's not just strategy, it's discipline. If a Greek hoplite had some skill in battle, were to leave the line, run over there and slaughter 15 of the enemy, including the enemy king, and come back, he would have disgraced himself, because he would have dropped his shield. He would have exposed his friends to death and ruin, and ruined, taking a chance on losing the entire battle. So it was discipline. It was maintaining ranks. It was doing things that are very difficult to do, not running away and not running forward either. And when these disciplined ranks of guys 6 shields deep or 3 or 7 went at these Asian armies, it was just simply over. They just slaughtered them. It was just unbelievably effective for 500 years until the Romans beat them. And the Romans beat them because they did it better. Technically, it was the Greeks and the Macedonians and the Romans. But in any event, they were just refinements of this idea. We need soldiers. We don't need warriors. We want people who can stay in line, because when we fight as a unit, we win. When we fight as individuals, we lose, because we don't have a whole lot of training. We're farmers. We know how to stand in line. We know how to march forward. We know how to hold a shield up. We know how to poke guys with a stick. That's pretty much all we need to know. We don't need to know how to be archers, and we don't have to ride horses, and we don't have to do all this stuff. We just need to stay in position and trust the person next to you, march forward, and poke things. It's pretty much it. And it was unbeatable. Unbeatable. And I think that's fascinating. So it's taken me a lot longer to describe it than I would in a script, because I can boil all this down. But I think if you've got a bunch of kids watching a movie about fighter pilots set almost 1,000 years in the future, and they go out and become fighter pilots in the game, they're always just flying around, and you explain to them tactics and discipline will win when we've got garbage equipment. And I did a little test with a friend Matt in one of these little combat rooms in Star Citizen, and for the first time I'd ever played a cooperative game. I've done that many times, cooperative with a human against other humans or against computer opponents. This is the first time I ever went into one of those situations and I said, our primary duty is to watch out for the other one. And it was remarkable. It was just amazing. Absolutely amazing, the difference. And so basically you say to these pilots in the movie, and then of course that presumably goes into the heads of the young people, you say, if you go out there, 4 of you, and one of you shoots down 600 enemy aircraft, but it costs you your wingman, you've failed. There are times when that might be necessary, but if it turned out that you went out there and broke discipline, caused your wingman to be killed, and there is no respawn and there is no reset, none of it, no reboot, nothing, he's gone, he's dead, then you have failed. And when you start thinking that way, it does amazing difference. And I think it'll show up in the tactics in the game, and that means it'll show up in the minds of the young men and women that we're trying to reach with this thing. So anyway, I got a great story, and it's going to be one way or another. It's going to be great to be able to tell story, and I want to get to things like Big Bad Problems, live action movies. It take $1.5 million, $2 million. This would take $100,000, and I get to be a director and a writer, and a little bit of acting and all the rest of it, and I can start very soon. So there we go. That's that. I couldn't resist it. That's all I've been thinking about. Just been writing movie storylines. It's just been great. So again, apologies. I know some people said, please no more Star Citizen, but we're really just wrapping up the show here. And if you want to be a part of this, again, just email me with Star Citizen in the title. I haven't gotten back to anybody yet, but I'm about to. And we don't just need people playing fighter pilots. We need guys who understand economics. We need people who can run a shipping company and make a profit. We need all of these things, and it'll be fun. In any event, and we'll need actors in the movie. We'll need actors in the world as well. So that'll do it for episode number 157. Shorter than most, but I knew I couldn't get out in less than an hour. I just had a feeling it wasn't possible. Anyway, thanks again for all of the support as always, and the patience. Many of you members out there, it's been a little late on members-only content while we got the NRA show up. But it's up and running, and we're trying to get back on that. I'm doing an interview with Dave Rubin tomorrow, which should be interesting. And I think that'll wrap it up. So thanks again for our members. Thanks again for your continued support. And unless there's a tough break kid moment between now and next Wednesday, we will see you next week. And we will see you right here on the Stratosphere Lounge. You guys have a great evening.